I glanced around the dimly lit bar, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale beer. My eyes settled on Carter, my older brother, sitting across from me, his expression one of pure joy as he gazed at his new wife, Elsie. She was gorgeous, no doubt about it, with her long blonde hair and striking blue eyes, but something about her made me uneasy. "She's perfect, isn't she?" Carter gushed, his hand resting on top of Elsie's. "I can't believe how lucky I am." I forced a smile, not wanting to dampen his excitement. "She's certainly beautiful." Elsie leaned forward, her red lips curling into a coy smile. "Ah, thanks, Layla. You're too kind." My husband Ethan chimed in from beside me. "She's a real stunner, that's for sure. You hit the jackpot, bro." I shot him a sideways glance, but he seemed oblivious to my discomfort, his eyes lingering a little too long on Elsie's exposed cleavage. As the night wore on, Ethan's comments about Elsie's appearance only became more frequent and more overt. "Damn, Elsie, you're just too hot for words." Carter laughed it off, but I could see the hint of unease in Elsie's eyes. I decided to confront Ethan later when we were alone. On the drive home, I turned to him, my jaw clenched. "What the hell was that back there?" He shrugged nonchalantly. "What? I was just giving the new sister-in-law a few compliments. It was inappropriate and disrespectful." I snapped, to both me and Carter. Ethan's face hardened. "Relax, Layla. It was harmless flirting. Doesn't mean anything." I shook my head, my stomach churning with a sickening sense of dread. If only I had known then how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The first few months after Elsie joined our family were relatively uneventful. Carter seemed blissfully happy, and I tried to push aside my lingering doubts about his new wife. That is, until I started noticing Ethan's strange behavior. It began with him working late nights more frequently, claiming he had important projects to complete. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I noticed him constantly checking his phone with a silly grin on his face whenever he received a text message. "Who are you texting all the time?" I asked one evening as we sat watching TV. Ethan quickly pocketed his phone. "Just some guys from work, babe. No big deal." I knew he was lying, but I decided not to press the issue further, at least not yet. A few weeks later, we attended a family barbecue at my parents' house. Carter seemed unusually subdued, confiding in me that the stress from his job was taking a toll on his health. "I'm worried about Elsie, too," he sighed. "She's been feeling isolated, stuck at home all day while I'm at work." My eyes drifted over to where Elsie was standing, laughing animatedly as Ethan whispered something in her ear. A familiar pang of jealousy twisted in my gut. Later that evening, I witnessed a moment that would forever shatter my trust in Ethan. We were getting ready to leave when I noticed him pull Elsie aside, his hand lingering on the small of her back as he leaned in close. Too close. I confronted him about it in the car, my voice shaking with rage. "What the hell was that back there with Elsie?" Ethan scoffed. "You're overreacting, Layla. She had something stuck in her hair, and I was just trying to get it out for her." I wanted to believe him, but the sick feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. From that moment on, I knew something was happening between my husband and my sister-in-law, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The news about Carter's illness hit us like a ton of bricks. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, and the prognosis wasn't good. As our family rallied around him, I found myself keeping a closer eye on Ethan and Elsie, searching for any sign of impropriety. At first, Elsie played the devoted wife, doting on Carter and promising to take care of him every step of the way. But I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that her concern was merely an act. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard Ethan's phone buzz with a new message. He must have forgotten it on the kitchen counter. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the screen and felt my heart drop into my stomach. It was a text from an unknown number, accompanied by a suggestive photo of a scantily clad woman lying on a bed. The message read, "Can't wait to see you again, handsome." I confronted Ethan later that night, thrusting the phone in his face. "Care to explain this?" His eyes widened, and he snatched the phone from my hand. "It's not what it looks like, Layla. I swear." "Then what is it, Ethan?" "Because it sure as hell looks like you're cheating on me." He shook his head adamantly. "It's just some spam text, babe. You know how those things can be." I wasn't buying it, not for a second. But before I could press further, he stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my suspicions and a sinking feeling that the truth was far darker than I could have imagined. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with finding concrete evidence of Ethan's infidelity. I scoured his phone records, laptop, and even his car, desperately searching for any clue that would confirm my worst fears. And then, one fateful afternoon, I found it. Hidden in the trunk of Ethan's car was an old burner phone, and when I turned it on, my heart nearly stopped. The phone was filled with explicit messages and photos exchanged between Ethan and Elsie, leaving no doubt about the nature of their betrayal. I confronted Ethan again, this time brandishing the burner phone as indisputable proof. But even then, he denied everything, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, a cruel joke played by someone out to get us. I didn't believe a word of it, but I had no choice but to play along for the time being. After all, with Carter's health hanging by a thread, the last thing our family needed was more turmoil. But mark my words, I vowed to myself I would make them pay for what they'd done, no matter what it took. Carter's condition continued to deteriorate, the cancer ravaging his body despite the aggressive treatments. As a family, we did our best to remain positive, but the writing was on the wall. In the end, Carter lost his battle, passing away surrounded by his loved ones. The days leading up to his wake were a blur of grief and anger. I could hardly stand to be in the same room as Ethan and Elsie, knowing the depth of their betrayal. And yet, they had the audacity to act like nothing was amiss, clinging to each other as they mourned the man they had so callously deceived. During the wake itself, I couldn't help but notice the odd distance between Ethan and Elsie. Gone were the covert glances and lingering touches that had first aroused my suspicion. Instead, they seemed almost cold toward one another, their interactions stiff and formal. It was in that moment that the truth became crystal clear. Their affair had been nothing more than a tawdry fling, fueled by lust and selfishness. With Carter gone, they had no reason to maintain the charade any longer. The realization made my blood boil, but I forced myself to remain calm, biding my time until the opportunity for vengeance presented itself. That opportunity came at the end of the wake when I overheard Elsie speaking in hushed tones on her phone. "I know, it's been so hard putting on this act," she whispered. "But now that Carter's gone, we can finally be together, just like we planned." My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped out from the shadows, burner phone in hand. "You mean like how you planned to betray my brother and destroy our family?" I spat, my voice dripping with venom. Elsie's eyes went wide with panic as she realized she'd been caught. "Layla, I can explain," but I didn't give her the chance. With a few taps on the burner phone, I pulled up the damning evidence of her affair with Ethan, the explicit messages, the photos, all of it laid bare. "Save it," I growled. "I know exactly what you two did, and I have all the proof I need right here." Elsie opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips as Ethan appeared, his face pale as a ghost. In that moment, I knew I held all the power. These two snakes had slithered their way into our family, poisoning it from the inside with their lies and deceit. But no more. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions, once and for all. With the evidence of Ethan and Elsie's affair laid bare, I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't let them wriggle their way out of this, not after the pain and humiliation they had caused our family. It was time for them to face the consequences. The next day, I sent out a group text to our extended family, inviting them to a memorial gathering at my house. I framed it as an opportunity to come together and celebrate Carter's life, but my true intentions were far more sinister. As our guests began to arrive, I couldn't help but notice the uneasy glances Ethan and Elsie kept shooting each other. They knew something was up, but they had no idea what was in store. Once everyone had settled in, I cleared my throat and stood up, the burner phone clutched tightly in my hand. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice trembling ever so slightly. "As you know, we're here to honor the memory of my dear brother, Carter." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "However, before we do that, there's something else that needs to be addressed." Ethan and Elsie exchanged a nervous look, and I could practically hear their hearts pounding. "For months, I've been living a lie," I continued, my gaze boring into theirs. A lie perpetrated by two people who were supposed to be part of this family, my husband, Ethan, and my sister-in-law, Elsie. A collective gasp rippled through the room, and I saw my mother's eyes widen with dawning horror. Ethan and Elsie have been carrying on an affair, I said, my voice rising with barely contained rage. An affair that began while my brother was still alive, sick and vulnerable. I held up the burner phone, the damning evidence displayed for all to see. I have proof, explicit messages, photos, all of it. They betrayed us in the worst possible way, and now it's time for them to face the consequences. The room fell deathly silent, everyone's eyes fixed on the two cheaters, whose faces had drained of all color. Finally, my mother spoke up, her voice shaking with fury. "How could you?" she spat, glaring at Ethan and Elsie. "How could you do this to our family?" She turned to me, her expression a mixture of sorrow and pride. "Layla, I'm so sorry you had to go through this, but you did the right thing by exposing them." Then, her gaze hardening, she addressed the two betrayers once more. "You are no longer welcome here. I want you both out of our lives for good." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but my mother cut him off with a stern glare. "Don't bother trying to explain yourselves. Your actions speak louder than any words ever could." As Ethan and Elsie slunk out of the house, their heads hanging in shame, I felt a sense of bittersweet triumph. The battle had been won, but at what cost? Our family had been torn apart, our trust shattered beyond repair. But in that moment, as I looked around at the faces of my loved ones, the ones who truly mattered, I knew that we would persevere. We would rebuild, stronger and wiser than before. And Ethan and Elsie, they would have to live with the consequences of their actions, forever branded as the ones who betrayed their own flesh and blood. In the days following the explosive reveal, Ethan tried to reach out to me, pleading for a chance to explain himself. But I wasn't having any of it. "Layla, please," he begged over the phone, his voice thick with desperation. "Just hear me out. It wasn't what it looked like." I scoffed, my grip tightening around the receiver. "Save it, Ethan. I don't want to hear your lies anymore." "But I love you," he insisted. "What Elsie and I had, it was just a fling, a moment of weakness. It didn't mean anything." "It meant everything," I shot back, my anger boiling over. "You betrayed me. You betrayed Carter, your own brother, how could you do that to our family?" There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought he might actually take responsibility for his actions. But then, in typical Ethan fashion, he tried to shift the blame. "Elsie, she came on to me," he stammered. "She was so lonely, and Carter was always working. It just happened." I let out a bitter laugh. "You're unbelievable, you know that? Always finding someone else to blame for your mistakes." "Layla, please, I'm sorry," he pleaded. "I'll do anything to make it up to you. Just give me another chance." But I had heard enough. "It's too late for that, Ethan. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment there was only silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't mean that." "I've never been more serious in my life," I replied, my resolve unwavering. "It's over, Ethan. For good." As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The weight of his betrayal had been lifted, and for the first time in months, I could breathe again. But my reprieve was short-lived, as Elsie soon came knocking at my door, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Layla, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I crossed my arms and glared at her. "I have nothing to say to you." "Please, just hear me out," she begged. "What happened between me and Ethan? It was a mistake, a horrible, stupid mistake." She took a deep breath, her eyes pleading with me for understanding. "I was so lonely, and Carter was always working. Ethan was there, and he made me feel wanted, desired, but it didn't mean anything, I swear." I shook my head in disgust. "You're pathetic, you know that? Using loneliness as an excuse to betray my brother, who loved you more than anything in this world." Elsie flinched as if I had slapped her. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for what I did. But please, you have to believe me when I say it's over between me and Ethan. It was just a fling, a moment of weakness." But her words fell on deaf ears. In my eyes, she was no better than Ethan, a snake who had wormed her way into our family only to poison it from the inside. "Save your excuses," I spat. "I don't want to hear them. Just stay the hell away from me and my family." With that, I slammed the door in her face, leaving her to wallow in the mess she had created. As for me, I was done. Done with the lies, done with the betrayal. It was time to move on and start piecing my life back together, one shattered fragment at a time. With the truth about Ethan and Elsie's affair laid bare, the fallout was swift and merciless. I wasted no time filing for divorce, citing infidelity as the grounds for terminating our marriage. As for Ethan, he found himself ostracized from both his personal and professional circles. News of the scandal spread like wildfire, and suddenly, Ethan's once stellar reputation was in tatters. His colleagues at the law firm where he worked couldn't seem to look him in the eye anymore, and whispers followed him wherever he went. It didn't take long for the consequences to trickle down to his career. One day, he was called into his boss's office, emerging with a grim expression on his face. "They demoted me," he confided later, his voice laced with shame, "said my behavior reflected poorly on the firm, and they couldn't have someone so untrustworthy in a position of authority." I felt a pang of satisfaction at the news. After everything he had put me through, it was only fitting that he should suffer the consequences of his actions. But as much as I wanted to revel in Ethan's downfall, a part of me couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He had thrown away everything, his marriage, his family, his career, all for a fleeting affair with a woman who didn't even seem to care about him. Speaking of Elsie, she didn't fare much better in the aftermath of the scandal. With Carter gone and Ethan's financial situation in shambles, he could no longer afford to support her lavish desires. Without a steady stream of income to bankroll her extravagant lifestyle, she quickly found herself cast aside, just another discarded plaything in Ethan's wake. I caught a glimpse of her one day, wandering aimlessly down the street, her once pristine appearance disheveled and worn. She looked lost, a far cry from the confident, alluring woman who had so effortlessly seduced my husband. A small part of me felt a twinge of pity for her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the lingering resentment I felt towards her betrayal. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it, alone, forgotten, and utterly irrelevant. As for me, I tried my best to move on with my life, to leave the pain and heartache of Ethan's infidelity behind me, but it was easier said than done. The scars of his betrayal ran deep, and no matter how hard I tried, they never seemed to fully heal. Still, I persisted, determined to rebuild my life one day at a time. I threw myself into my work, found solace in the company of friends and family who had stuck by me through it all. And in the quiet moments when the memories of Ethan's deceit threatened to overwhelm me, I would remind myself of one simple truth. I was the victor in this battle, not him. He had lost everything. His wife, his respect, his dignity, and for what? A cheap fling that had ultimately amounted to nothing. In the end, the only person who had emerged from this ordeal with their integrity intact was me. And that, perhaps, was the greatest revenge of all. The day my divorce from Ethan was finalized, I felt a bittersweet sense of relief. On one hand, it marked the end of a chapter in my life that had been marred by betrayal and heartbreak. But on the other, it also represented a new beginning, a chance to start over and rebuild myself from the ashes of my shattered marriage. As I walked out of the courthouse, the weight of Ethan's infidelity finally lifting from my shoulders, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. Just a few months earlier, my world had been turned upside down, my trust in the person I loved most utterly shattered. But through it all, I had remained strong, resolute in my determination to see justice served and my family's honor restored. And in the end, I had emerged victorious, while Ethan and Elsie were left to contend with the consequences of their actions. Still, as satisfying as their downfall had been, I knew that dwelling on their misfortunes would only serve to poison my own spirit. It was time to let go of the anger and resentment that had consumed me for so long, and instead focus on forging a new path for myself. With that in mind, I made a decision, one that would not only honor the memory of my dear brother Carter, but also help others who had experienced the same heartbreak and betrayal that I had. I used a portion of my divorce settlement to establish a foundation in Carter's name, dedicated to providing support and resources for individuals and families dealing with the aftermath of infidelity. It was my way of turning my pain into something positive, of ensuring that no one else would have to suffer in silence as I once had. As word of the foundation spread, I was inundated with messages of support and gratitude from people who had been touched by similar tragedies. Their stories were heartbreaking, but also inspiring, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hurt. And slowly but surely, as I immersed myself in this new purpose, I began to heal. The wounds left by Ethan's betrayal may never fully disappear, but they no longer defined me. I was more than just a scorned wife. I was a survivor, a fighter, and a beacon of hope for those still struggling to find their way. Of course, there were moments when the past would come creeping back, threatening to undo all the progress I had made. Like the day Ethan showed up on my doorstep, his eyes pleading with me for forgiveness. "Layla, please," he begged, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can never make up for what I did, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I was a fool, a selfish idiot who threw away the best thing in his life for a cheap thrill." I regarded him coolly, unflinching in the face of his remorse. "I appreciate your apology, Ethan, but it's too little, too late," he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand. He trailed off, shaking his head. "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." "Forgiveness isn't for you," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "It's for me, and I've already forgiven you, if only to free myself from the weight of your betrayal." With that, I turned my back on him, leaving him to contend with the wreckage of his own making. As for me, I had a new life to build, one that was stronger, brighter, and infinitely more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined before. The road ahead might be long and winding, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. I was a survivor, a warrior, and most importantly, the master of my own destiny. And nothing, not even the ghost of Ethan's infidelity, would ever hold me back again.